The world is now facing the worst economic crisis in decades, triggered by the COVID-19 pandemic. As many countries start lifting their lockdown measures, the economic recovery may not gain steam anytime soon. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development says this global crisis will have dire consequences worldwide. And to discuss them, I'm now joined from Paris by the OECD Secretary General Ángel Gurría. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Mr. Gurría, most of the forecasts indicate a recovery starting from the second half of this year, but according to the OECD outlook, it may be rather slow. What are those long-lasting economic effects of the COVID-19 pandemic?
Well, first of all, we're saying minus 6% for the world economy in 2020 in the case of no recurrence of the pandemic. If we have a second wave, we're saying it can go to a contraction of 7.5%, maybe even more. And the reason is because, among other things, there's a question of confidence that has to recover. There's a question of investment that has to recover. There's a question of trade tensions that have to disappear. But there's also the debt that we will be left with, and that's governments, and that's corporations, and that's households. And that will make it a little harder to take off. So we're looking more at a U-shaped recovery rather than a V-shaped recovery.
When it comes to the issue of debt, there are growing concerns there's going to be the next generation paying for this debt.
It's always the next generation that pays for the debt. That has not changed. The only question is, this generation has to spend enough to beat the virus. Throw everything you got at it. Win the battle against the virus. Debt is a consequence of the victory against the virus, but it will have consequences later on. This is why we have to be rather sober about the recovery. It's going to take longer, and it's going to take more thrust simply because it's going to be heavy on the wings.
So you think there should be this shift in terms of the debt perception and no longer to perceive the debt as something bad, as we've seen after, for example, the financial crisis?
Debt is a tool. Debt is never intrinsically bad or wrong. You can use debt wisely and judiciously to advance your growth, your development, some programs, provided ideally, that the projects that you finance with the debt pay for themselves, or that they generate a global good to your society, to your country, that will be worth paying for it. But now is not the time to be looking at the rule book on the debt question. Right now, we have to give everything we got to beat the virus first, then we'll have to deal with the consequences.
How has the pandemic accelerated the shift from the great integration to the great fragmentation, and has it?
I think the mere expression of great fragmentation is an exaggeration, just like the great integration was, because we never achieved the level of integration that we wanted, and we should not let the pandemic stop the process of integration. Europe is going to become more and more integrated. The future of Europe is integration. An integrated Europe will be better off. The level of well-being will be increased. Health systems are not, the responsibility of the European Commission. They are the responsibility of each one of the countries. So you basically are dealing with different policies and different ways of addressing different ways in which you read the numbers and you react to the numbers. But in the end, you've had a fairly steady and I would say fairly generalized approach, which is in the absence of a medicine, in the absence of a vaccine, you do what effectively is the second best, which is confinement and then social distancing, and controlling the process very, very prudently, very gradually.
Do you think there might be a threat to the general move towards the globalization after the pandemic? Because we saw that what happened with the COVID-19, there was a massive disruption, for example, of supply chains.
Don't blame globalization for the flawed national policies or the lack of international cooperation. Globalization, by definition, rests on a very strong foundation of international cooperation. If the international cooperation is not there, and you have trade tensions, and you have, in some cases, literally, military tensions, and you have problems of flows and social tensions, and you have flare-ups and discontent in many countries, etc., then, of course, you are lacking that glue that puts the whole thing together. And blaming globalization can be, well, stylish or voguish, but it's not going to get you anywhere because it doesn't get you to a solution.
Mr. Gurría, we talk a lot about the new normal for us, for people, when it comes to social distancing, when it comes to testing, tracking, tracing, isolating. What is the new normal for the global economy?
The new normal, hopefully, will include the fact that we should take the opportunity to remind ourselves, for example, of our single most important intergenerational responsibility, which is dealing with the planet, dealing with climate change. And therefore, bravo to those countries that are now saying, in the recovery, I will be supporting greener solutions, either in the car industry or in the airplane industry or in the shipping industry, etc. So you are combining the support of the more, the hardest hit sectors, the more vulnerable sectors, with policies that drive you towards a better future.
The OECD Secretary General Ángel Gurría. Mr. Gurría, thank you for this interview.
Thank you very much.